This podcast is brought to you by Most Valuable Podcasts, leading the league in podcasting entertainment.
What's up, everybody? Ricky Widmer here, and welcome in to the Primetime Podcast here on Most Valuable Podcast. Want to thank you guys for checking us out for another week, but as always, I'm joined by the one, the only, Brandon Swanson.
Hey.
And Brandon, another good week of college football. Alabama, LSU had a good game. We had Nebraska, or as Colin Cowherd would call them, the fake ID, getting blown out by Ohio State. And then the Washington Huskies, they just kept on rolling against Cal this week. Some more good games, and hopefully these games that we had this week are going to solidify a college football playoff ranking that we can use at the end of the year.
Yeah, you would like to think so, right? But I think that there were a lot of really interesting games, especially that Texas A&M versus Mississippi State game that came down to the wire, and they get a loss, their second loss. They were the number 4 team, and now they're booted out of there, at least in the AP poll. They've gone down to 10. They'll also be booted out of there in the playoff rankings as well. There's no way they stay up there. But hey, now that kind of gives you a little look into what this committee is maybe looking at. Not necessarily zeros in the lost column, but who they really think is the 4 best teams.
Well, and that's the most interesting thing. And before we get into our first topic, I'll kind of overlay the show for you guys. The first thing me and Brandon are going to talk about is that just issue. We're going to predict the top 4 that we are going to see on Tuesday from the selection committee in college football for the playoff. Then we're going to dive into some Washington. Could an undefeated Washington team be left out of the playoff when it's all said and done? And then look at the top 2 teams in college football, Alabama and Michigan, and kind of answer the question, should the Crimson Tide kind of be looking over their shoulders at the Michigan Wolverines coming right behind them? But Brandon, the first thing we are going to dive into is these college football rankings, and that was the big thing last week. I was driving home from work late last Tuesday night, and they were kind of going over the rankings on ESPN Chicago, and when they said, Texas A&M coming in at number 4, I immediately thought of our good friend Sean Anderson and how angry he was going to be that the Washington Huskies were left out of the top 4.
But I think that at the same time, you take a look at who A&M had played, how they had played against those ranked opponents, and they played better against those opponents than Washington had played against nobody.
Well, the SEC greater than the Pac-12, right? That's what that meant. The Pac-12 is a weaker conference than the SEC, so even though you lost to an Alabama, you beat more ranked teams in your conference just because of who's there, and that Alabama loss doesn't look that bad because you lost to Alabama, who's the best team in the country.
Well, you beat UCLA when they were ranked. You beat what is now a good Auburn team. You beat an Arkansas team that was ranked at the time at 17. You beat a Tennessee team who was at the time ranked number 9, who was playing I'll use good loosely, good football. You kept the game relatively close against Alabama, 33-14. You didn't get blown out like Tennessee did. I think that you played some much better opponents than what Washington has played, so it makes sense. I think people were probably surprised, but I think it makes sense when you take a look at it. And then, unfortunately, you lose this game to Mississippi State this past weekend, 35-28. But then again, you have to remember Trevor Knight got hurt. He was not playing healthy when he was in there for a couple of snaps anyways. But there's still some big games, Ole Miss, and then you play LSU to end the season.
Well, and the big thing that'll be interesting to look at this week, and I know that the funny thing is these rankings are going to be coming out on Election Day this week, so we kind of got 2 big things that are going to be announced. Who's going to be running the country and who's going to be in the playoff picture after the first 10 weeks of the season. To me, it's going to be interesting to see, and in my mind, there are 2 teams that could overtake a Washington team in the playoffs this week: Ohio State and Louisville. And really it comes down to, what are you going to do as a committee? Are you going to finally say, okay, Washington, you're undefeated, we're going to put you in at that 4th spot? Or are they going to say, hey, you know what? You played a Cal team. Yeah, you got a big win over it. But, hey, this Ohio State Buckeye team, they kind of blew out the number 10 team on our rankings in Nebraska. So even though there are some people out there that didn't give Nebraska any respect, kind of like last year's Iowa team, does the committee go, hey, you know what? This Ohio State team, they played pretty good against a ranked team. We're going to put them ahead. Or do they say, you know what? This Louisville team's been good. They have one loss as well. If it's you, Brandon, and you're sitting there in the committee, do you think there's, before I ask you who's in, who's out, are there any other teams than the two that I listed, Ohio State, Louisville, that you could see overtaking Washington for that fourth spot in this Tuesday's rankings?
No, I really don't. I think that those are the two teams that I think most people will be taking a look at. Wisconsin has still been there, but I don't think that they're any more powerful than Louisville or Ohio State when it comes down to that. Auburn, I don't think so either. And then certainly not Oklahoma. But I think that Louisville and Ohio State are probably the two teams that they'd be looking at outside of Washington. The three before that, Alabama, Michigan, and Clemson, are locked in there at those three spots. But it's that number 4 spot right now that's up for grabs. And certainly the committee was not willing to give it to Washington last week. They have a big blowout win over Cal this past weekend. But I still don't know if they give it to them.
Well, and the big thing that I'm looking at is kind of on ESPN, they have this playoff picture thing. And under resume ranks, this is the rankings for their resume, they've got some interesting things. Strength of schedule, strength of record, and then what they're calling game control. And if we look at the three teams, Washington, Louisville, and Ohio State, because really those are the three teams, maybe in Auburn we can throw in there later in the year, but they would have to beat an Alabama squad to even be pushed into that discussion, no matter how well they're playing right now. But if we look at like strength of schedule, Ohio State's got, out of those three, Ohio State's got the best at 42, Louisville's in the middle, 55, Washington's at the bottom with 67. Then you look at strength of record. Washington has the best because they have won every single game, then Ohio State, then Louisville. Then in game control, this is one that'll be interesting because Washington's at a 2 right behind Alabama, so they have a better game control than Michigan and Clemson, but then Ohio State at 5, Louisville at 6. So to me, it's going to be interesting which one of these three the committee kind of goes in on. And to me, the one I would focus in on is kind of like college basketball. You got to go in with that strength of schedule because to me, Ohio State has played the tougher schedule, and that schedule ain't going to get any more easier, especially when you got Michigan sitting there at the end of the year. And then if you beat Michigan and you're able to go to the Big Ten title game, that means you get another shot at either Nebraska or Wisconsin maybe, and that's just going to boost your strength of schedule yet again. So to me, that's the one I would focus in on. And if that's the case, if I'm Washington, I'm kind of sitting there a little nervous because what are you going to do? What's on your schedule that's going to boost up that strength of schedule?
Yeah, I think that when you take a look at both of those schedules, I agree with you. I think that Ohio State's schedule has been a little bit more potent one as opposed to Louisville's schedule. And then I think that there's been a lot more, I shouldn't say a lot more, but there's been a couple more games where Louisville has played and has really struggled. Duke, they win 24-14, but they struggle in that one. Virginia, they win 32-25. They struggle in that one. I think that there were, those couple of games out of the ACC, the bottom feeders of that ACC conference, they really struggled with. They got the wins, but they struggled. And I think that when you take a look at Ohio State, outside of that game where they lost to Penn State, a divisional rival, a conference rival rather, I think that you take a look at that. It wasn't their best game, but it was a game within the conference, and that is always going to be probably a hard-fought matchup. But I think that when you really take a look at the rest of the games outside of that, you take a look at that Nebraska game, a Nebraska team that has been pretty good this season, ranked number 10 at the time this past weekend, and they blew them out to the wall, 62-3. So I think that You take a look at the games they played, and then you look at how they played in those games against those ranked teams. So I think that you also have to take a look at, on the opposite side, on the flip side, of how Louisville played in those games against those unranked teams of Duke and Virginia.
Well, and I mean, I know that we are right now predicting the college football playoff after Week 10, but just to look ahead for Louisville, they've got a Houston team coming up that's going to be on the road, and then they've got a Kentucky team. So they've got 2 more games that are going to be hard in their own rights. But the one thing I thought about with Ohio State this week is maybe we got to bring back the trend that I called it last year during college basketball season. I called it the curse of the primetime podcast, because there would be times where it'd be like, oh, Michigan State undefeated. Can they go all the way undefeated? They'd lose. We would talk about Iowa. Oh, they haven't lost a game. Are they at the top? They'd lose. On this side, we talked just last week about Ohio State and their hopeful and despite the offensive woes. And what do? They scored 62 points against Nebraska. So in that sense, I'm sitting there going, did we have anything to do with that? Well, of course, I'm thinking about myself, but I'm like, did we have anything to do with that? Are we bringing back the curse of the primetime podcast? But it was interesting to see an Ohio State team go and score 62 points after they haven't scored that many points since Rutgers when they started the month of Ohio on October 1st. But just to kind of give all of this first segment kind of a little bit of an end, Brandon will get down to it. If you are predicting what the committee is going to do this Tuesday, what do you think the top 4 and the college playoff teams will be on November 8th at about 7 o'clock Eastern time?
I'm going to say that the number 1 team is Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say the number 2 team is Michigan. The number 3 team is Clemson. And the number 4 team is Ohio State.
Here's the interesting thing, and I can't disagree with you. I'll say this. I think Washington is going to be out as well. I'm going to put Ohio State in there at 4 just because that strength of schedule. Here's the one thing that I think could mix up yours, and I think what we will see on Tuesday. If we go with last week's rankings, we saw Alabama, Clemson, Michigan, and Texas A&M. I think we see the same top 3. I think we see Alabama at 1, even though they had a close 10-point game against LSU. That's kind of a game you would expect against rivals and good opponents in the SEC. Clemson, Michigan, the thing that'll be interesting is did Michigan do enough to jump Clemson? And I think that because Clemson and Michigan both had blowout wins, I think Clemson's was a little bit greater in score. So they'll keep Clemson 2, they'll keep Michigan at 3, and then it comes down to that 4th spot. Like I said, I am going to agree with you. I'm going to pick Ohio State only because of the strength of schedule. Yes, Washington has the record. Yes, they have game control, but that strength of schedule is just so far behind in Ohio State. And I really do think for Washington, the only saving grace that is going to help them make the playoff at the end of the year, if they want to, is winning the Pac-12. If they could win the Pac-12, they can have that ace in the hole kind of sitting there. But until they have that, I just think that the Pac-12 is so weak that these other conferences, mainly the SEC and the Big Ten, can overtake them without any problems. But that's going to do it. We're going to move on. But before we do, you guys let us know. Give your predictions down below for what do you think the college football playoff is going to look like. And if you're a Washington fan, let us know what you think down below. I know Sean will let me and Brandon know in person what he thinks because he's always supporting his Washington Huskies. But